Thanks for tuning in to Watch Top People. I'm here with Brady Murray. Brady's our first guest on the show, and we're a live broadcast right now. And Brady is the CEO and founder of Rods Racing.
That's right.
And I've worked with Brady and known Brady for a few years, and I know very little about Rods Racing. Mm-hmm. So what I do know is that there's somehow triathlons involved, or races and adoptions for kids with disabilities. Mm-hmm. And so let's kind of start there and go with what is Rods Racing and,
sure,
and how you would best describe it.
It's a great question. I appreciate you letting me on your show and be able to share something that's very near and dear to my heart. Rods actually stands for Racing for Orphans with Down Syndrome. And so I think that a lot of people have a lot of questions on how in the world do you get Ironman triathlons or endurance athletes, because that's the type of racing that we do, and orphans and Down syndrome all into the same thing.
Yeah.
And it actually goes back to when my son was born. And so we have 5 children now. And my second child, Nash, was my first son. And I remember it very clearly. It was July of 2007, and we were expecting Nash, and rushed to the hospital, and here we go, going to bring a child into this world, and I'm super stoked because it is my firstborn son, right? Everything that you just would inspire you to be motivated for that situation. My wife did a fantastic job in the delivery, and before I knew it, there was my son. And he was perfect. Everything was fantastic. Mm-hmm. But I could note that the doctor and the nurses were like really quiet, right? And it just like something was up, and I couldn't quite tell what it was. It was probably 10 minutes after Nash was born that the doctor came over to me, and he kind of pulled me aside and put his arm around me, and he said, "Brady, we think that your son has Down syndrome." And that was the first that I had ever heard of that. And I didn't really know anybody with Down syndrome. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what that meant for Nash or for my family or anything else. It was a pretty scary time. Mm-hmm. I remember going to my wife shortly thereafter, just a few minutes after, and I was scared to death because I didn't know what I was going to tell her. Right? I didn't know how she was going to react. And so I leaned down and whispered in Andrea's ear and just said, you know, the doctor thinks Nash has Down syndrome. And she didn't skip a beat. Like, it didn't change anything for her. And she was just as happy as she was before I told her that. And I knew from that moment on that this little guy, was a very special kid, and mm-hmm. everything was going to be okay. And I actually felt very, very clearly there was something inside of me that said, this is a kid that's going to inspire a lot of people. And so fast forward a few years, and Nash was just the highlight of our life, and just such a little stud. And I remember it was through Nash and being involved in the Down syndrome community where we lived at the time that I learned something that really changed, like absolutely changed what my reality was. And I learned that it's very common in many cultures that when a child's born with Down syndrome, that they're immediately placed into an orphanage. Okay. And I started looking into this, and it was crazy because I'm seeing these kids that are the same age as my son, but they're malnutrition, they're just in a horrible, horrible circumstance. And I read further and learned more and found out that many of these kids actually pass away typically in their first 5 years of life just because of the harsh circumstances that they were involved in.
Is this all over the world?
That's a great question. It's actually something that typically happens in maybe more developing countries, okay. And so less developed countries, that tends to be the situation. And it's not so much that the families don't know what to do, or that they don't want this child. It's more so that it's not part of their society, the resources that are available. I mean, quite frankly, in the US 50 years ago, same thing. When a child was born with a disability, they'd go into a facility, and that's where they'd stay for their entire life. And so when I saw this, I'm like, I've got to do something about this. And long story short, my wife said, well, you know, why don't you do an Ironman triathlon to be able to raise funding for these kids and to be able to raise awareness?
Had you done an Ironman before?
No.
That?
And I'm like, why don't you do an Ironman triathlon, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'd done like some tiny little triathlons, you know, the ones where you slide down the slide and you swim in the pool and you ride your trike type of stuff.
Yeah.
but I'd never ever considered an Ironman triathlon before. And I clearly remember that, to where, you know, we felt strongly we wanted to help these kids. And before that, there's no way I could do an Ironman triathlon. And when that challenge was given to me, I was like, no longer is it about me, right? Now it's about doing this for these kids.
Yeah.
And so
So how do you bring those two together as
Yep.
far as?
Yep, great question, great question. And so the reason behind the Ironman, and the reason why Andrea encouraged me and challenged me to do it, is that we found out for these kids, like, there's actually a lot of families that are ready and willing to adopt these kids. The only thing that they're lacking is the financial resources to be able to do it.
Okay.
And so typical international adoption costs around $30,000 to $40,000.
Okay.
And like, for a typical American family, that's just too much to ask to go across the seas to be able to adopt somebody
Yep.
to come up with that type of money. And so we had this idea of doing this triathlon because it's kind of a crazy thing to raise awareness, number one, but also to raise funding and to do different fundraisers around it. So that was where the connection originally
Okay.
started between Down syndrome, orphans, and Ironman triathlons.
So how is the structure of it to where, you know, you're reaching out and getting funding? How does that work as far as, is it public donations that are coming in?
Yeah.
People that are just know about rods racing and they're donating money to, to sponsor somebody that's going to race?
Sure. Yeah. So how it started originally was pretty wild, actually. I remember, you know, it was actually pretty close to Christmas time, and I went to my family and I'm like, look, guys, like, I'm gonna do an Ironman, and rather than buy me presents, like, donate to this fund that I'm trying to create for me doing an Ironman. And I'd ask my buddies, I'd be like, look, an Ironman's 140.2 miles, right? So 2.4 miles swim, 112-mile bike, and then you top it off with a marathon, right?
Yeah.
So 140 miles total. I'm like, will you pledge a nickel for every mile that I do? Or would you pledge $1 for every mile that I did? I was just trying to get creative that way.
Okay.
And it was amazing, and I learned something very, very, very true in that scenario, is that I learned that if I allowed myself to get caught up in a cause bigger than myself, something that wasn't about Brady Murray and putting an Ironman sticker on my truck, but about truly helping somebody else, that miracles would take place. And that's what I witnessed. I had hoped to raise around $15,000 for one of the orphans, or an orphan that I was going to race for. And I expected that'd take me like all year of training, and we actually raised $20,000 in less than 30 days.
Wow.
And so it was amazing.
So you pay the entry fee to get into the Ironman and get through that process, and then it's just reaching out, getting donations, you know, to sponsor you to race. And then whatever gets raised goes
straight to the
into
adoption account.
Okay, that's something I've never understood. Is how does it take place?
Yep. So at the time, there was a nonprofit that we were working with, that all the donations just funneled directly to them. And this little guy that I was racing for, his name is Eli, and he was in Lithuania. And so people would go on PayPal, make a donation, and put in their pledge for Brady Murray doing an Ironman, and there you go. And so what's interesting, though, what took place after that was another miracle. Because when I started doing this, I was planning on doing Ironman St. George, and it's just down the road from us here in Utah. And Ironman, the actual corporation, found out about this, and they started to follow it. And there started to be some publicity that took place, and exactly what we wanted. There was awareness that was created, and some TV shows picked us up, and some different things. And I'll never forget, I was sitting, ironically enough, in a Down syndrome conference back east, and I got a phone call. And it was from an individual. He said, my name's Rob. You don't know me, but we have a lot in common. I have a son who has Down syndrome, and I'm an Ironman triathlete. And as well, I am the CEO of the company that is sponsoring the 2012 Ironman World Championship.
So company,
corporate and
sponsor.
He said, we want to have you come to Kona and race in the Ironman World Championship, and we're going to feature your story on NBC.
Sweet.
And so that was like my break, right?
Yeah.
Like that was the scenario where it's like, now it's not local, Now it's going to a national level or even international level. And ironically enough, that's how rods racing got started, was from the exposure.
And that was your
NBC.
first triathlon?
It was my second.
Or Ironman.
Right, so I did
St. George.
St. George was my first one, and that was a debacle. Like, I finished, right, but it almost killed me.
Yeah.
And then the second one that I did was in Kona.
Oh, wow. How far apart were those two races?
I did St. George in May, and Kona was in October.
Wow.
So
no,
just enough time to keep training.
So what's going on with rods racing today, as far as, if you go, what's the website?
Yeah.
How do people get in contact and see rods racing?
Yep, super simple. It's rods.org. You'll see our website there. So what we're doing right now is, after that NBC exposure, I had athletes from all around the world literally contacting me saying, we want to do what you do. So we dedicate 20, 25, 30 hours a week towards training for these endurance races, and we want to do what you do. And so the idea clicked on where I'm like, let's start a nonprofit, and let's race with these guys, and let's bring them on the team, and these guys are going to be able to fundraise as well. And so that's where the idea was born. You fast forward now to this year, we've got 224 athletes racing from literally all over the world on our behalf. And we just passed the $500,000 mark of funding that we've raised. And most importantly, we've actually helped 21 children now.
That's what was going to be my
next
question.
Be able to find a loving family.
Wow.
It's kind of a cherry on top of the ice cream sundae. The 20th child that we got to help is a son that I adopted, and so now we have 2 children who have Down syndrome. And Cooper is from China, and he's doing great. He's a wild child.
And you mentioned that Cooper was left on a doorstep, or just left out in the middle of the road as a baby to be found.
Yep.
Right?
So when we felt inside us, and I would consider Cooper another one of those miracles that I've been able to witness by getting caught up in a cause that's bigger than any one person. When we started looking, and we found Cooper, and we knew that was the child that we wanted to adopt, we had all of his files and his information sent to us just so we could understand his background and his story. In the file, it was very clear. It was from a police report that they guesstimate that he was about 6 months old.
Wow.
And they found him on a street. I actually know the exact spot. I went and visited that was in kind of like a factory, really busy area where they found Cooper. And so they found this little baby, and they took him to an orphanage, and he was there for about 4 years, and then we adopted him.
And if following Brady on Periscope or on any social media, once in a while he'll share some video and some footage of what how much fun is taking place inside of his home. And I would definitely tell you to follow Brady on any social media, because there's a lot of fun things going on in his house. His family's big chess players.
Apparently, we went to, my wife and I went to Mexico this last year on a little vacation, and I had never played chess in my life. And they had these big chess boards there, and some of the people we were with started teaching me, and so I bought this Mayan ruin chessboard and brought it home, and my kids have just like taken it to a whole nother level. Every night they're just lining up to play dad, and they're whooping on me. It's no fun.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe some checkers for me.
Yeah, even better.
Chess isn't there.
Yep,
so
even better.
Well, thanks for your time today, Brady.
Absolutely.
If you want to get involved with Rods Racing, follow Brady, reach out. It's rods.org, and reach out, and there's a great way to help some people. And thanks for your time today, Brady.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate
Thanks.
it. Okay.